Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today on our YouTube channel. My name is Madison, and I'm the director of Peace Restored. We're a nonprofit organization that works with women that have been through various difficult life experiences, and we're so excited to have you join us today. If you've been watching our series this month, you know we've been talking on the topic of grief. When we think of grief, we often think of physical loss. We think of the death of someone that we love. And today we're going to talk about a delicate topic, one that we do want to warn you that if you're listening to this with younger people around, you may want to protect them, and you may not want to have them privy to this conversation. So we just ask that you would just acknowledge that and take any necessary steps that you need to for that. But to get us kind of jump into that conversation, I'm going to introduce Taylor to you. If you've been around our channel, you've met her and you're probably coming to love her like we all do. Taylor is our director of communication, and she does a wonderful job with us at Peace Restored. And so Taylor, you want to say hi to everybody and anything you'd like to kind of start out with?
Hi.
Okay.
I'm Taylor. Yeah, you introduced me. I don't really have much else to say.
That's okay. So we're going to talk, like I said, about grief. And grief is a topic that I'd say most people are familiar with, wouldn't you say, Taylor?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, I think most people have had somebody they know that's died, whether it's close to them or not. So the closeness and proximity of relationship is going to vary for all people. But I think we can all understand the concept of grief from that standpoint. But I think one of the things that's hard for us to understand is, how does trauma and grief go together? Which is a question I, as the director of Peace Restored, get a lot, is why in the world do you work with grief and trauma? And that's something we're going to kind of try to tap in today, is how do those two go together? And why is it necessary to talk about how they go together? Because when we think about grief and trauma, there are so many things that we have to grieve individually, that we have to learn to let go of. And sometimes there are those internal dialogues, and sometimes there are things even deeper than that that we have to grieve and let go. So Taylor, if you would mind start talking to us about what is it that you want to talk to us about specifically from that trauma point of view, and how does trauma and grief, how did they intersect in your world?
So I want to talk about the time where I was working through my own experience with sexual trauma. As a kid, I was violated in that way, and when I grew up and came to know the Lord, I finally started to understand that this is going to sound crazy, but that what happened to me was bad, because I was a very young kid, so I didn't know. Mm-hmm. And I had like this gut feeling that it was bad, but I really didn't know. And I think the gut feeling was God's common grace and giving us that innate ability to kind of have a sense of right and wrong. But at the end of the day, I really didn't understand that something traumatic had happened. And I just kind of went about my life and like was just trying to figure stuff out. And there were so many emotions that would come up that I didn't realize were a direct result of that trauma.
Yeah, when we go through a trauma, it affects us in ways that we don't expect. And I think the common response is, oh, you've been through something terrible and we feel bad for you. But what most people don't understand, if they haven't been through a trauma, which if they haven't been, I'm so grateful for that for them, they haven't had to go through that experience. But if you haven't been through that, one of the things, and even if you have, I guess I should say, you don't always realize that that traumatic experience is going to stay with you much longer than you expect, especially when there is a sexual trauma involved. because God designed us to relate with people intimately, but when that is broken, it affects us in a profound and deep way. And so because of that, there's many things that we have to learn to let go of, and we have to grieve through. And so we can probably sit and talk on this for a good hour of how trauma and grief intersect. But let's dive into some of that and talk about how that grief, what are some specific ways that you had to kind of walk through that, or some things that you had to grieve and let go of?
So I would say the first thing that comes to mind is that I had lost was a sense of innocence that I really didn't understand that I had lost until I was much older.
Mm-hmm.
And I lost kind of this chance to be ignorant to sexual things that I didn't know. And
Mm-hmm.
as I was around other kids, I kind of like realized they didn't know some of the things I knew. And I was very confused by that. I mean, I was a young kid, but I couldn't really do anything with it. And until I got older, and I was like, oh, I didn't have this normal childhood. Although I will say most of my childhood was pretty fine, but other than that experience.
Mm-hmm.
And I had to grieve losing that. And then something else was that I lost protection in that moment, because it was someone who was supposed to be a figure in my life who was supposed to protect me, and they didn't. And I had to grieve that sense of protection, and I would get kind of angry because all these other people had people in their life who protected them and shielded them from you, and that just made me so angry.
Mm-hmm.
And I lost a relationship in that moment with that person. I had a relationship established, a trusted relationship established, which is incredibly like common for that. And I had to grieve that because I wanted to have that relationship still, and I couldn't.
Mm-hmm.
And I knew, and even though I technically wanted to have a relationship, when I was a young kid after that happened and I was kind of pulled away from that person, just by circumstance, it wasn't really because I spoke up, it was just a happenstance. And I really think that was the Lord's protection, but I never understood that at the time. And I still wanted that relationship. I wanted that trusted relationship I had before, but it was broken. I couldn't have that. Even though I was very cautious now around that person, you have that trusted relationship and you want that back. And I lost a safe space because it was that was a trusted relationship. It was in a home I was in frequently, and that I felt safe in. And once that started happening, I didn't feel safe in that home anymore. And I think the last thing that I had to like learn more that I lost was this chance to process negative feelings properly. Because like I said, I didn't understand what happened until I was much older, and I had buried a lot of this loss and these negative emotions, and I didn't even know I was doing that. And that has come up now in other areas of my life where I don't want to process things, and I'll have this tendency to go back to just burying things down, even though that's not a healthy way to grieve.
Yeah. Yeah, I think those are all really good things that you bring up, Taylor, that there are so many layers of grief when it comes to trauma. If you have been watching our series last month, and when we were talking about generosity, towards the end of that month, I released a story, my own story. And so you guys would have seen in that I walked through a similar story that Taylor's walked through. I had my own sexual trauma that I walked through. as well. And so all the things that Taylor's talking about are very familiar to me, because, you know, I had to learn a lot of the same things that Taylor's had to learn. She's had the benefit of learning them much younger than I. Maybe part of that was my stubbornness, or maybe it was just the time that God knew that I could handle that information too. I didn't start walking through my trauma until I was in my 30s. And so because of that, I'm still learning some of these processes and things that I need to let go and grieve as well, because I think it's a continual thing. Sometimes I think when we've been through a trauma, we think we have to be over it now. And we need to just be able to grieve that or get over it and just move on. And do you find that's kind of been this experience that either you've been through or people you've known have been through, where they're just like, I should just be over this by now?
Yes.
Yeah.
That's the most common thing I've seen people walk through, and that I did too, because I get frustrated with myself, I think, when things kind of come to mind, or something happens that makes me remember what happened in a different light or whatever, and I get upset with myself because I think I should be over that, and then I'm reminded that I don't have to be completely over that, and that God's still working that out in me.
Yeah, I think it's that continual, like you're talking about, the continual process of grieving what should have been a perfect either relationship or perfection in different ways, of maybe ideologies, the ways that we think, the ways that we relate with people, maybe our thought patterns, maybe the ways that we just connect with other people. All those things have now been impacted, and we have to learn to grieve that, because when you've been through a traumatic experience, you can idealize what you expect things to look like. And when they don't fit that mold, if we haven't grieved through that, then we can kind of get stuck back in our own trauma, can't we? Yeah. And it can be, like you talked about, I think we can end up getting in a place to where we want to then beat ourselves up. And that's not a good place for us to be, to help us through our healing, because we ultimately want to heal and help others heal through this. And this is not an easy thing to do, but it's a necessary thing to do. And so I want to just encourage everybody who's maybe watching this, saying, man, this is heavy. And it's not fair. I think we can acknowledge that it's not fair that you have to grieve the things that somebody else did to you. Yeah. I think we can acknowledge that, that this is very hard, and that we wish there was another way that they could go through this, but we also acknowledge that you have to work through that trauma and work through all those areas of grief, because if you don't, they're just going to keep coming up and bubbling up, and they will periodically. And like, I think you made a good point, Taylor, is that they'll bubble up, but they're not going to look like always like the same experience, right? Like, they're not going to be that experience from when you had that first encounter where that innocence was broken. It's going to look a lot different each time. And so there'll be different things within you that's now been impacted, where you have to grieve and let one more part of that go. So would you like to add anything to any of that, or talk a little bit about how you've seen that happen in your own life, how you've had to adjust your behaviors or adjust your feelings and adjust your grief processes as you've matured in your own walk?
Well, I grieved in a lot of unhealthy ways at first. I lashed out at people who I didn't really need to lash out to, who hadn't hurt me in that way, but I treated them like they had. And I didn't open up to anyone about what happened. I didn't think I had anyone who was safe whenever these started to come up and I started to understand what happened. I I didn't even really attempt to confide in anyone. I didn't know that I should, but it would have made me feel better just to tell someone, and I wouldn't. I refused because I'm stubborn too. And I was just like, I think my grief translated to anger for me. So instead of dealing with my emotions, I was just angry all the time. And I had to learn that that wasn't okay, and that the people I was lashing out at didn't do anything to me. And they were loving me and really trying to help, but I had this distorted view now of love and what happened. So it was really hard for me to accept and learn how to let people love me in the way that that's supposed to like be. And the other thing was, I mean, I had to stop being angry, but so it translated to anger, but on a bigger scale, I was just hurt. And I had to like sit and deal with that hurt, and it was messy and ugly, and it was not fun. It's awful to walk through, but I will say that in God's kindness, it gave me really, really safe people who I trusted and who were able to walk through that, and not only just walk through it, but they grieved with me. And that's not, I don't know how to describe that besides saying it, because I don't know that it's something you can truly understand until you have a person who will sit in grief with you and just allow you to feel whatever you're feeling and cry, scream, do whatever, and just grieve the losses you've experienced, and and there's those people allow you to share your experience and not judge you or like kind of tell you your experience, because I think that can happen, and you have to have really safe people so that that doesn't happen.
Yeah, thank you for that. You mentioned how you went through that time where you were so angry, and you were, kind of, that was the way that all this trauma kind of manifested itself in you, was through anger. And I was reminded of a book by Dr. Dan Allender called The Wounded Heart. And in that book, he talks about self-contempt and other contempt. And so usually when you've been through a trauma, you will experience either one or both of those sometimes, but usually you'll be more heavily on one side of the fence or the other. You'll either be like, have that contempt, or like you were talking about, anger towards others, or you'll turn it inward and you'll have a lot of anger towards yourself. I was the opposite. I was, and I still struggle with that inward contempt or that inward anger with myself. And so it's interesting from a counseling perspective, I'll say, to see how that affects each person differently. There's not a one script. Oh, I've been through trauma, and your story is similar to mine, or Taylor's, or whose ever. Your experience or how your body processes and how your mind processes is going to be so totally different. But then you talked about how, kind of that, but God, because of God and because of who he is and because of his character, he comes in, he walks through this with us, and he's faithful and gracious and patient with us to help us figure it all out. And I don't think we ever fully arrive to having it all figured out, but God just continues to walk with us. And like you said, provides those people around us to give us a safe place. And at Peace Restored, we kind of hope to be that safe place for others, where we can give people that safe place to land, if you will, and just be able to walk it out and figure out, if this is your story, how do I walk out this sexual trauma that I've been through? How do I learn to even say the word sexual trauma? How do I grieve these hard things and not let it totally destroy me? So I think that's a fear for people when they've been through a trauma, like you're talking about, Taylor, is that if I let those feelings in, if I open that door, as some people think of it as Pandora's box, that I'm never going to be able to close the door, and it's going to take over, and it's going to be too much and too big and too heavy, and just keep filling those blanks with all the what ifs, right? But I think, again, we have to go back and we have to change our focus and say, but because of Christ and because of what he can do, because of the hope that he gives us, and then hopefully if you can, connect with places like Peace Restored or friends that you might have that can help you walk through that healing journey, there is a but God moment where you can have a different level of healing. So I'd like to encourage you that if you're watching this video today and this is your story, please reach out to someone. Find that safe person to talk to, someone who can walk with you through grieving. If you don't feel like, if you need a counselor to talk to, please reach out to us at Peace Restored. We'll have all of our information down in the bio below, down the content, where you can just send us an email. You can go to our website. You can even schedule an appointment. It doesn't matter where you're located. You can connect with us. And we can have a virtual connection, just like we're doing here on Zoom right now, where Taylor's at her location in Kentucky and I'm at my location in Indiana. We can still work together. We're still ministering together, and we'll still do the same with you no matter where you're located. So again, just go to our website. It's peacerestored.net, but again, it's going to be linked below for you. But Taylor, I'm going to toss it back to you. And if you have anything else you'd like to encourage people with today, or something else you'd like to say about grief, but the hope that we have because that we are allowed the privilege to grieve, I'll let you do that.
I think I'm gonna say something about Peace Restored, actually.
Okay.
So, like Ann said, I'm in Kentucky, and I learned about Peace Restored, I don't know when, but a couple years ago. And I remember being relieved to find out that Peace Restored existed, because I was an adult when I found out about Peace Restored, and when I was younger and going through all of the things I just described, and there's so many more layers to that, but I would have benefited tremendously from a place like Peace Restored, but it didn't exist. I mean, even when I was walking through what I was walking through, Peace Restored wasn't in existence. And I remember I met Ann, and I was so grateful that she had walked through that and had obeyed the Lord and started Peace Restored. And I was very overwhelmed and just thankful for all the people who were going to get to walk out their own traumas and their own griefs and the difficult things they experienced at Peace Restored, not at Peace Restored, but with Peace Restored, walking that out with them. Mm-hmm. And it was overwhelming. And I think the most beautiful part about Peace Restored is that it all centers around the hope that we have because of Jesus and what he did for us. And I guess I would encourage people to reach out either to Peace Restored or a safe space, that a safe friend or whoever that you can think of, but reach out to someone and don't walk through this alone, because like we've mentioned, there is hope and there is a God who absolutely loves you and values your life.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. I think I'll just add to that one quick sentence and just say, if you're watching this and this is your story, we cannot stress enough that you are not alone. You are seen, and we want to hear you, and you have value. So again, thank you for watching. We'll look forward to talking to you next time.